Welcome to my channel.
The village of Lochdub was entirely swallowed by a thick, freezing fog that had rolled off the sea just before dawn. It was the sort of dense, white Highland hair that muffled sound, chilled the marrow, and provided excellent cover for a policeman engaged in a spot of illicit activity. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, his flaming red hair plastered to his forehead with the damp, was currently hauling a heavy lobster pot up from the icy depths of the loch. His long, lanky frame strained against the rope, his police tunic unbuttoned over a thick, misshapen fisherman's sweater. On the rocky bank, his dog, Lugs, let out a soft, whining yawn, clearly questioning the necessity of being awake at this hour. "Wisht, Lugs," Hamish whispered, his hazel eyes gleaming with satisfaction as a rather magnificent, snapping blue lobster broke the surface of the water. "That's breakfast, lunch, and dinner sorted, if we don't let the busybodies catch us." Hamish carefully transferred his prize into a damp burlap sack. His stomach gave a loud, echoing rumble. He was perpetually hungry, and the biting cold only sharpened his craving for a massive plate of fried eggs, black pudding, and a pot of strong, scalding coffee at the local hotel. More importantly, he needed to get back to the police station to safely stow his catch before Detective Chief Inspector Blair decided to phone from Strathbane headquarters to ruin his day. Hamish hoisted the sack over his shoulder and began the trudge back along the shoreline, moving like a shadow through the mist. He loved Lochdub on mornings like this. The isolation was absolute. There were no tourists, no barking superiors, just the slap of the water against the stones and the distant, mournful cry of a gull. Unfortunately, the peace was not destined to last. As Hamish neared the village, a sharp, angry voice cut through the heavy air, shattering the morning quiet like a dropped plate. "Hello? Hello? Can anyone in this godforsaken tundra hear me?" Hamish sighed, his shoulders slumping. He stopped, considering turning back and hiding in the heather until whoever it was simply wandered away or fell into a bog. But due to at least the fear of someone reporting him for dereliction of duty compelled him forward. Emerging from the fog, Hamish found a man who looked like he had stepped out of a catalogue for expensive, highly impractical country wear. He was wearing pristine, bright green tweed, a stiff flat cap, and leather boots that had clearly never seen a patch of mud. The man was furiously jabbing at a top-of-the-line mobile phone, his face an angry shade of puce. "Is there a problem, sir?" Hamish asked, adopting a look of profound, vacant stupidity. He let his jaw go slightly slack and widened his eyes, the perfect picture of a slow-witted Highland bumpkin. The man wheeled around, startled. "Finally! A local," he snapped, his accent sharp, clipped, and undeniably wealthy London. "My phone is dead. No signal. Nothing. What barbaric place doesn't have cell service? I am supposed to be at Tommel Castle." "Aye, well, the hills do be blocking the signals, you see," Hamish said slowly, dragging out his vowels. "Are you a tourist, then?" "I am Richard Sterling," the man puffed up his chest. "I've just finalised the purchase of the west wing of the Tommel estate. Turning it into an exclusive wellness retreat for corporate executives. I took the sleeper train into the nearest station and decided to hike the rest of the way to get a feel for the land. Instead, I am freezing to death in a cloud." Hamish's heart sank. A wellness retreat. That meant construction noise, organic juice deliveries blocking the single-track roads, and a steady influx of demanding, impatient Sassenachs demanding to know why the Wi-Fi wasn't working. It meant paperwork. It meant trouble. "It's a fair walk to the castle, Mr. Sterling," Hamish said, pointing a long finger into the white void. "You just follow the shoreline that way. Keep the water on your left. If your feet get wet, you've gone too far." Sterling sneered, looking Hamish up and down, his eyes lingering on the damp burlap sack. "Are you a poacher, or just a tramp?" "I'm the local policeman, sir," Hamish said mildly, tapping the badge on his tunic. Sterling let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Good Lord! They let anyone wear a uniform up here, don't they? Well, officer, if you see my contractor, tell him he's fired. And do try to look a bit more presentable. It lowers the tone of the area." Without waiting for a reply, Sterling stomped off into the fog, muttering bitterly about the incompetence of the Scottish workforce and the unbearable dampness. Hamish stood in the quiet for a long moment, petting Lugs, who had come to lean heavily against his leg. His vacant expression vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating glint. Richard Sterling had been in Lochdub for less than a day, and he had already managed to insult the police, plan the ruin of a historic estate, and radiate the kind of arrogant wealth that always bred resentment in a tight-knit village. "Mark my words, lugs," Hamish murmured, shifting the sack on his shoulder. "That man is going to cause us no end of grief. Let's get the kettle on before the shouting starts." The sanctuary of the Lochdub police station was a small, cluttered kitchen where the scent of old floor wax battled the aroma of roasting coffee. Hamish Macbeth had successfully smuggled his poached lobster past the curtain-twitching gaze of the Nessie sisters and plunged it straight into boiling water. The heavy fog outside pressed against the window panes, wrapping the village in protective silence. Hamish stoked the ancient cast-iron stove, listening to the comforting crackle of wood. Lugs had claimed the worn rug by the hearth, letting out a contented sigh. For a glorious, uninterrupted hour, Hamish was simply a man enjoying breakfast. He ate a massive plate of scrambled eggs and black pudding, and poured himself a scalding mug of pitch-black coffee. This, he thought, staring blankly at the wall, was how life in the Scottish Highlands was meant to be lived, slowly, deliberately, and without the interference of bothersome tourists. Naturally, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered his peaceful reverie. Hamish winced, his hand pausing halfway to his mouth with a piece of toast. He stared at the black rotary phone as if it were a venomous snake. He let it ring 5 times, hoping the caller would simply give up. When it reached the 10th ring, he knew it was futile. Letting out a heavy, mournful sigh, he dragged his lanky frame out of his chair and picked up the receiver. Before he could utter his sluggish greeting, a voice erupted from the earpiece. It was Mrs. Wellington, the village postmistress, shrieking loudly enough to make Hamish pull the phone away from his ear. "Hamish Macbeth, you lazy good-for-nothing, get yourself up to Tommel Castle this very instant," she hollered, her breath hitching in terror. "There is a dead body on the ground." Hamish closed his eyes, silently mourning the remainder of his quiet morning. "Calm down, Mrs. Wellington," he said, his voice slow and heavily accented, leaning into the persona of the village idiot to try and soothe her panic. "Are you quite sure they are dead?" "Perhaps they have just taken a wee tumble into the heather." Mrs. Wellington let out an indignant squawk. "A wee tumble. He is stuffed head-first into the ornamental fountain in the courtyard. I was up delivering the morning mail when I saw his boots sticking out of the water. He is as dead as a salted herring, Hamish." Hamish rubbed the bridge of his nose. The man in the green tweed. Richard Sterling. He had not even survived a full 12 hours in Lochdub. "Right you are. Don't touch anything. I will be up in a bit." He hung up and looked down at Lugs, who thumped his tail once. "Well, boy, the Sassenach has gone and got himself murdered, and he could not even have the common decency to do it on my day off." Hamish buttoned his police tunic over his thick sweater, not bothering to comb his damp, fiery red hair. He looked entirely dishevelled, an image he carefully cultivated to ensure nobody expected too much from him. By the time Hamish and Lugs arrived at the sprawling grounds of Tommel Castle, the fog was finally thinning, revealing the jagged stone turrets of the ancient estate. A shivering crowd had gathered around the central courtyard, kept at a safe distance by a pale estate manager. Hamish ambled through the wrought-iron gates, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his posture slouching. He looked like a man dragged out of bed against his will, which was entirely accurate. He approached the large stone fountain. Mrs. Wellington had not exaggerated. Richard Sterling was submerged upside down in the freezing water. His legs dangled awkwardly over the stone rim, the bright green tweed thoroughly soaked. It was a profoundly undignified way for a wealthy Londoner to meet his end. Hamish stood beside the fountain, his face perfectly blank, his jaw slightly slack. To the gathered villagers, he looked utterly lost, overwhelmed by the sight of a genuine crime scene. But behind his hazel eyes, Hamish's mind was moving with razor-sharp precision. He noticed Sterling's expensive leather boots were scuffed with a peculiar, chalky white dust that did not match the muddy terrain. He also spotted a small, dark bruise on the back of the dead man's exposed calf, shaped oddly like a crescent moon. Someone had struck him before shoving him into the water. Hamish mentally catalogued the faces in the crowd, noting who looked shocked, who looked secretly relieved, and who was trying far too hard to appear horrified. His peaceful morning was thoroughly ruined, and worse, he knew Detective Chief Inspector Blair would soon descend upon Lochdub, bellowing orders. The real work had officially begun. Hamish stood by the fountain, his hands deep in his pockets, projecting complete bewilderment. The clearing fog left the Tommel Castle courtyard bathed in pale sunlight that did nothing to warm the freezing air. Mrs. Wellington was hovering nearby, clutching her tartan shawl, while the estate manager, Callum, looked as though he might be sick. Hamish was about to ask Callum about the chalky white dust on the dead man's boots when a sound like a dying tractor echoed up the driveway. It was the Strathbane police incident van, followed by a roaring, unmarked police car that took the final corner too fast, spraying gravel over the lawn. The doors burst open before the vehicle had stopped, and Detective Chief Inspector Blair heaved his bulk into the crisp morning air. Blair was a man whose default state was simmering rage, his face permanently mottled red from bad temper and a steady diet of cheap whiskey. He wore an ill-fitting trench coat that strained over his stomach, and his tiny eyes locked onto Hamish with instant loathing. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his voice carrying across the courtyard and causing a flock of crows to scatter from the battlements. "Stand away from the deceased, you towering streak of Highland misery! Have you contaminated my crime scene with your filthy poaching hands?" Hamish blinked slowly, letting his mouth hang open in a perfect mask of stupidity. "I was only looking, Mr. Blair," he said, his voice a soft, slow drawl that he knew infuriated his superior officer. "He is well and truly stuck in the fountain, you see. Looks like he might have taken a tumble." "A tumble? He is upside down in 3 feet of water, you imbecile." Blair stormed over, followed by his 2 long-suffering lackeys, Detectives Jimmy Anderson and Harry Higgins. Anderson looked hungover, while Higgins held a notebook with the desperate grip of a man hoping to become invisible. Blair leaned over the edge of the fountain, peering at the submerged head of Richard Sterling. "Well, who is he? Have you figured that out, Macbeth, or were you too busy dreaming about your next stolen salmon?" "His name is Richard Sterling, sir," Hamish replied mildly. "He is the Sassenach who just bought the West Wing. He was wanting to turn it into a fancy retreat." Blair straightened up, a cruel smile spreading across his fleshy face. "Is that a fact? A wealthy Londoner buys up half the estate, plans to bring in money, and ends up murdered on his first night here. It does not take a genius to work this out." He turned to face the villagers. "Which one of you backward yokels did it, eh? Did not like the idea of progress? Did not want a posh Englishman telling you what to do?" Hamish sighed inwardly. Blair was as predictable as the Scottish rain. Instead of examining the body, looking for the chalky dust, or noticing the crescent-shaped bruise on the dead man's calf, Blair was already deciding the motive and looking for a convenient local scapegoat. His eyes fell on Callum, who was trembling. "You there!" Blair barked, stabbing a thick finger at Callum. "You look guilty enough to hang. Did he threaten your job? Did you hit him over the head and tip him in to keep your cushy position?" "No, sir, I swear," Callum stammered, backing away. "I was in my cottage all night." "We will see about that," Blair sneered. He turned back to Hamish, his expression souring further. "Right, Macbeth, you are useless here. Go direct traffic at the end of the lane. Keep the press away if they show up, and do not try to think. It might strain your tiny peasant brain." Hamish touched a finger to his cap, suppressing a smile. "Right you are, Mr. Blair. I will just be keeping out of your way, then." It was exactly what Hamish wanted. Being dismissed meant he was free to roam. He whistled for Lugs, who trotted to his side. As Anderson and Higgins began hauling the dripping corpse out of the fountain, Hamish turned his back on the blustering chief inspector. Let Blair yell at the terrified manager and trample over the evidence. The real clues would not be found by shouting in a courtyard. They would be found in the quiet corners of Lockdub, in the unspoken grievances and whispered gossip. Hamish planned to start his investigation at the local bakery. Solving a murder was hungry work, and he needed a pie before he could deduce who had hit Mr. Sterling and left him to drown. Hamish strolled down the winding single-track road leading away from Tommel Castle, his hands still shoved deep into his pockets. The pale sunlight was finally burning off the last wisps of the morning har, revealing the stark, purple-heathered slopes of the surrounding hills. It was turning into a beautifully clear, biting cold day, the sort of weather that made a man appreciate a warm fire and a hot meal. Behind him, the faint, furious shouting of DCI Blair echoed from the castle courtyard, a sound that brought a small, satisfied smile to the policeman's face. Let the Strathbane men stomp about in the frost. Hamish had a much more effective method of policing, and it began with his stomach. He and Lugs ambled into the heart of Lockstub, making a direct line for the village bakery. The bell above the door chimed a cheerful welcome, instantly accompanied by a wall of glorious, yeasty heat. The aroma of freshly baked bread, buttery scones, and savoury mutton pies was intoxicating. Behind the glass counter stood Fiona Macbeth, a formidable woman with flour dusted across her apron and a rolling pin resting loosely in her grip. She took one look at Hamish's drooping shoulders and the tragic, starving hound expression he had perfected over the years, and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "It is a criminal offence, Hamish Macbeth, the way you look at a pie," Fiona scolded, though her eyes were fond. "You look as though you have not eaten in a week, despite the fact I know you had a massive plate of eggs at the station this morning. The Nessie sisters saw you." "Ah, but Fiona, a man's metabolism works twice as hard when he is faced with a murder," Hamish murmured, pulling a stool up to the small counter. He lowered his face into a mask of pure exhaustion. "Blair is up at the castle, shouting the rooks out of the trees, and I have been banished. I'm pretty weak with all that shock. A cup of tea and a pie might just save my life." Muttering about the uselessness of the police force, Fiona pushed a steaming mug of tea and a hot, flaky mutton pie across the counter. Luggs immediately sat at Hamish's feet, resting his chin heavily on the policeman's boot. Hamish broke off a corner of the crust, tossing it down to the dog before taking a large, appreciative bite. He chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch out, knowing that in Lochdub, a vacuum of conversation was always quickly filled. "So, the Sassenach is dead, then," Fiona said finally, leaning her elbows on the counter and lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The whole village is talking about it. Mrs. Wellington was squawking so loud in the post office they heard her in the pub." "Aye, face down in the ornamental fountain," Hamish replied, taking a slow sip of his tea. "A terrible shame. I met him myself, just this morning in the fog. He told me he was hiking up from the sleeper train. Did you happen to see him before he met his watery end?" Fiona scoffed, wiping down the counter with a damp cloth. "See him? The whole street heard him. He came marching in here demanding a soya milk flat white and a gluten-free pastry. When I told him he could have a strong brew and a plain scone, he called my shop a medieval hovel." She paused, her expression darkening. "But it was not just me he insulted, Hamish. Rory Campbell was here getting his morning rolls. The Sassenach took one look at Rory's overalls and asked if he was the plasterer working on the castle's west wing." Hamish stopped chewing. He remembered the chalky white dust on Richard Sterling's expensive leather boots. "And what did Rory say?" "Rory told him he was the master plasterer." "Aye. And the Sassenach started shouting right then and there. Told Rory his work was shoddy, that he was fired, and that he was going up to the castle to throw all of Rory's tools into the loch." Fiona shook her head. Rory went white as a sheet. "He stormed out of here looking like murder. You know how proud he is of his trade. And he has been desperate for the money since his wife became ill." Hamish finished his tea, his mind working rapidly beneath his messy red hair. Blair was currently terrorizing the estate manager, entirely convinced it was a crime of local rebellion. But Hamish knew that a man's pride and his livelihood were far more dangerous motivators. A furious plasterer, a threat to destroy tools, and white dust on the dead man's boots. It was a neat, tidy picture, perhaps a bit too tidy. "You make a grand pie, Fiona," Hamish said softly, slipping off the stool and leaving a few coins on the counter despite her protests. He whistled for Luggs, his lazy demeanour returning as he stepped back out into the freezing Highland air. It was time to pay Rory Campbell a little visit and see how dusty his boots were. The frost on the heather crunched under Hamish's heavy police boots as he and Luggs made their way toward the small, stone-built cottage of Rory Campbell. The sun was a brilliant, pale orb in the cloudless winter sky, casting long, sharp shadows. The freezing air stung Hamish's cheeks, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the bakery, but his mind was comfortably insulated, turning over the puzzle of the dead Sassenach. The chalky dust on the expensive boots was a glaring signpost pointing straight at the village plasterer. Hamish was inherently suspicious of obvious things. Before he could reach the turnoff for the cottage, the sharp, rhythmic clip-clop of hooves echoed down the narrow lane. Hamish paused, watching as a sleek chestnut mare trotted into view. Riding the beast with effortless, infuriating grace was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She wore a tailored riding habit that looked entirely impervious to the biting cold, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a velvet helmet. Their relationship was a tangled web of unspoken affection, profound class differences, and stubborn pride. Priscilla pulled gracefully on the reins, bringing the mare to a halt beside him. She looked down, her cool blue eyes assessing his dishevelled appearance with fond exasperation. "Morning, Hamish. You look as though you've been dragged through a hedge backward. I heard DCI Blair shouting all the way from my father's estate. I assume the new owner of Tommel Castle has met a sticky end." Hamish sighed, rubbing the back of his neck while Luggs sat and wagged his tail at the horse. "Aye, he took a fatal dip in the ornamental fountain. Richard Sterling, a terribly angry man in green tweed. Blair is currently up at the castle, threatening to arrest the estate manager for the crime of being Scottish. Priscilla's elegant eyebrows rose a fraction. Richard Sterling? The London financier? He told me he was opening a wellness retreat, Hamish said, leaning casually against a drystone wall, though he spent his first morning insulting everyone from the local policeman to Fiona at the bakery. I am actually going to see Rory Campbell. Sterling had a screaming match with him over some plastering work, and the dead man's boots were covered in white dust. Priscilla gave a soft, entirely unladylike snort. Oh, Hamish, please tell me you are not going to arrest a poor plasterer over some dust. Richard Sterling did not come all the way to Lochstub to inspect plasterwork. Hamish looked up, his feigned stupidity dropping completely. And how would you know that, Priscilla? Because my father has dealt with him in the city, she explained, leaning forward in the saddle. Sterling was a corporate raider. He bought distressed companies, stripped them of their assets, and fired everyone. He only pivoted to wellness recently because his reputation in the financial sector was absolutely toxic. The man was paranoid, obsessed with security, and surrounded by assistants. So, ask yourself this: why would a paranoid millionaire take the sleeper train alone, hike through a freezing fog by himself, and leave his luggage behind? Hamish frowned, the cogs in his mind turning rapidly. He was secretly meeting someone. Exactly, Priscilla said, a triumphant gleam in her eye. A man like Sterling does not wander the countryside for his health. He was having a clandestine meeting. The argument at the bakery with your plasterer was likely just his foul temper boiling over, or a convenient excuse to explain why he was walking around at that hour. Whoever he met at the castle, that is who put him in the fountain. Hamish stared at her, feeling a familiar mixture of deep admiration and profound irritation. She was entirely right. The chalk on the boots was a distraction, either accidental or deliberately planted. He had almost let his stomach and Fiona's gossip lead him down the easiest path, exactly as Blair would have done. He pushed himself off the stone wall, a slow smile spreading across his face. You are a terrifyingly clever woman, Priscilla Halberton Smythe, he murmured. I suppose I will have to start looking at the people he knew in London, rather than the men he yelled at in Lochstub. Priscilla gave him a dazzling, brief smile. Just try not to let Blair take all the credit this time, Hamish. And brush your hair. With a flick of the reins, she urged her mare into a trot, leaving Hamish standing in the road. He watched her go, his heart giving a familiar, useless thump. The case had just grown significantly larger than a village dispute. But as he turned his boots toward Rory Campbell's cottage anyway, he knew he still had to eliminate the plasterer from his inquiries before he could start hunting a corporate ghost. Hamish watched the chestnut mare disappear around the bend of the lane, the rhythmic sound of hooves fading into the crisp Highland silence. Priscilla's warning echoed in his mind, casting a cold shadow over the easy theory he had been cultivating. If Sterling was a corporate raider who never moved without a phalanx of assistants, his solitary hike through the fog was not a rugged adventure, it was a desperate rendezvous. Hamish adjusted the strap of his bag, his hazel eyes narrowing as he looked toward the small, slate-roofed cottage where Rory Campbell lived. Even if Priscilla was right about the broader picture, the local details still nagged at him: the dust, the bruise, and the sheer timing of the argument at the bakery. He had to be sure. He approached the cottage, noticing that the usual industrious sounds of Rory's workshop were absent. There was no whistling, no scraping of trowels, only the low, mournful lowing of a cow in a nearby field. As Hamish reached the gate, he saw Rory sitting on a bench by the door, staring blankly at a pile of gravel. The man looked 10 years older than he had a week ago. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands, usually so steady, were trembling slightly as he rolled a cigarette. Hamish leaned against the gatepost, adopting his most harmless, vacant expression. A grand day for doing nothing, Rory, Hamish said softly, letting his Highland lilt become thick and slow. Though I hear the new master at Tommel Castle was wanting to keep you busy. Terrible business, that. Rory jumped at the sound of Hamish's voice, nearly dropping his tobacco. He looked up, his face a mask of weary misery. The man was a devil, Hamish. He spoke to me like I was something head stepped in on the road. Fired me on the spot and threatened to toss my gear into the water. I've worked at this glen for 30 years, and I've never been spoken to like that. Hamish nodded sympathetically, entering the garden. Aye, he seemed a prickly sort of fellow. Fiona said you were fairly upset when you left the bakery. I don't suppose you went up to the castle to try and talk some sense into him last night. Rory's face went from pale to a deep, guilty crimson. I went up there, he admitted, his voice cracking. I went up there to get my levels and my pride back. I found him by the fountain. He started in on me again, calling me a lazy peasant. I shoved him, Hamish. I shoved him hard, and he fell back against the stone. but he was alive. He was shouting curses at me when I walked away. I swear on my life he was still breathing when I left him. Hamish felt a sinking sensation in his chest. A confession of assault was exactly what Blair needed to close the case and claim a victory for the Strathbane CID. If Blair found out Rory had been at the scene and had laid hands on the deceased, the plasterer would be in handcuffs before sunset, and the real killer would be halfway back to London. Hamish looked at Rory's boots. They were covered in the same white, chalky dust he had seen on Sterling's footwear. "Rory, did you notice anyone else on the grounds?" Hamish asked, his voice low and urgent, dropping the simple policeman act for a moment. "Think, man. Did you see a car? A light in the west wing windows? Anything that didn't belong?" Rory shook his head helplessly. It was thick with fog. "Hamish, I could barely see my own hand. But there was a cat, a big ginger thing. It came darting out of the bushes near the fountain just as I was leaving. Nearly tripped me up." Hamish paused, his mind flashing back to the crime scene. There were no cats at Tommel Castle. The estate manager was allergic to them, and the previous owners had kept hounds that discouraged any strays. More importantly, he remembered the crescent-shaped bruise on Sterling's calf. It wasn't a bruise from a fall. It was a mark of a specific type. Hamish knelt down, inspecting the hem of Rory's trousers. There was the white plaster dust, yes, but there was also a small, peculiar smear of something dark and oily. He touched it and sniffed. It wasn't grease or mud. It was expensive, floral-scented leather polish. Hamish stood up, his gaze turning back toward the castle. The obvious suspect had just given him a confession that didn't fit the physics of the crime. If Rory had shoved Sterling and left him shouting, Sterling would have climbed out of the shallow water. Someone else had finished the job, someone who wore fine leather and moved silently through the Har. The red herring was beginning to stink, and Hamish knew he had very little time before Blair's heavy-handed tactics forced a wrongful arrest. He had to find that cat and the person who had actually led the financier to his watery grave. Hamish left Rory Campbell trembling on his garden bench, the poor man's confession of a frantic shove still hanging in the cold Highland air. To a man like Blair, that admission would be the end of the Matera neat, violent bow on a tawdry village squabble. But as Hamish walked back toward the village, the oily scent of that floral leather polish remained stuck in his nostrils, a sophisticated perfume that had no business being on a plasterer's trousers or a dead man's calf. He knew fine well that Rory didn't own a cat, and neither did the castle. The ginger thing Rory had seen darting through the fog was beginning to take a different shape in Hamish's mind, one that had nothing to do with feline strays and everything to do with the wellness Sterling was so keen to promote. He detoured away from the main road, taking a sheep track that overlooked the Tommel estate. From this vantage point, he could see the flurry of activity around the fountain. Blair was pacing like a caged tiger, no doubt preparing to launch a series of raids on local cottages. Hamish sat on a lichen-covered rock, lugs settling at his feet, and pulled a small, battered notebook from his pocket. He wasn't looking at names of locals, he was thinking about the wellness retreat and Priscilla's mention of corporate raiding. A man who destroys companies doesn't build a retreat for health, he builds a fortress for tax evasion, or a sanctuary to hide from those he has ruined. The hidden motive wasn't the anger of a fired workman. That was too loud, too Highland, and too simple. The real motive was the silence Sterling had sought. Hamish remembered the specific shape of the bruise on Sterling's leg crescent moon. It wasn't a mark from a stone or a fist. It looked remarkably like the heel of a woman's shoe, specifically a heavy designer pump. He began to piece together the arrival of the Sassenach with fresh eyes. Sterling had arrived by sleeper train, claiming to hike for the feel of the land, but he had been met by someone. Rory had arrived later, shoved an already agitated man, and left him alive. Someone else had been waiting in the fog, someone who knew that if Sterling died in a tragic accident involving a local dispute, their own presence in Lochstub would never be questioned. His thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a sleek, silver sedan parked discreetly behind the old carriage house of the castle, partially hidden by a stand of drooping larches. It wasn't a police car, and it certainly didn't belong to any of the locals. Hamish adjusted his cap, his eyes sharpening. He recalled the ginger cat Rory mentioned. In the distorting thickness of a Highland Har, a long fox-fur stole or a shock of auburn hair could easily be mistaken for an animal by a panicked man. He stood, his knees cracking in the cold. The mystery wasn't about the ownership of the castle, it was about the contents of the West Wing. Sterling had been stripping assets for years. What if his final acquisition wasn't a company at all, but something stolen from a partner who didn't take kindly to being sidelined? Hamish began to descend the slope, moving with a sudden, purposeful agility that he never displayed in front of Blair. He needed to see that silver car and check the floor mats for white plaster dust and floral polish. The petty human element was there, just as it always was in MC Beaton's world. It wasn't just corporate greed, it was the sting of a personal betrayal. Sterling had planned to disappear into the Highlands with a fortune that didn't belong solely to him, leaving a trail of ruined lives behind him. He had underestimated the tenacity of the person he had betrayed, thinking a London socialite or a business associate wouldn't dare follow him into the damp, miserable wilds of Sutherland. Hamish reached the perimeter of the carriage house, keeping low. Through the dusty window of the garage, he saw a woman sitting in the silver sedan, her face obscured by a silk scarf, frantically typing on a laptop. She wasn't a villager, and she wasn't a guest. She was the shadow Sterling had tried to outrun. As he watched, she reached into the footwell and pulled out a pair of high-heeled shoes, wiping the soles with a cloth. The scent of floral polish wafted through the air. Even here, Hamish felt a grim sense of clarity. The trap was forming in his mind, but to spring it, he would have to play the fool one last time to keep Blair from ruinously intervening. He needed to make the killer believe that the stupid policeman had already settled on Rory Campbell as his victim. Hamish backed away from the carriage house with the silent, fluid grace of a stag, his heavy boots making no sound on the damp pine needles. The woman in the silver car was his ginger cat, a predator in silk and fox fur who had followed Richard Sterling into the mist to settle a very high-stakes account. He knew that if he simply marched in and arrested her now, she would have a team of London lawyers descending on Lockstub before the first frost melted, and DCI Blair would likely assist them just for the pleasure of seeing Hamish humiliated. To catch a fox, one had to lead it toward the hounser, in this case, toward a very specific, very public trap. He whistled for lugs and began to march back toward the castle courtyard with a theatrical lack of urgency. As he emerged from the trees, he saw Blair standing by the fountain, red-faced and screaming into his radio about search warrants for the entire village. Hamish wiped all trace of intelligence from his face, letting his mouth fall into its customary slack-jawed hang and dragging his feet, as if each step were a monumental effort of will. He waited until he was within earshot of the carriage house windows before he began his performance. "Mr. Blair! Mr. Blair, sir," Hamish shouted, his voice cracking with a feigned, breathless excitement. "I've done it! I've cracked the whole thing wide open." Blair turned, his eyes bulging. "Macbeth, if you are about to tell me you found a missing sheep, I will have your badge and your pension by sunset." Hamish stumbled into the courtyard, waving his notebook erratically. "No, sir! It's Rory Campbell, the plasterer. I went to his cottage, and the man was a wreck. He confessed to the whole thing. He said he hit Mr. Sterling right here by the water and left him for dead. He's even got the white dust on his boots to prove it. I told him to stay put while I came to get the real detectives." Blair's face transformed from a mask of rage to one of oily, self-satisfied triumph. "I knew it! A local savage, just as I predicted. Higgins! Anderson! Get to that cottage now and bring the man in. We'll have a confession signed before dinner." As the two detectives scrambled for their car, Blair turned back to Hamish with a sneer. "Even a blind pig finds an acorn once in a while, Macbeth. You finally did something right by coming to your best. I'll take it from here. You stay here and guard the crime scene. Don't touch a thing, or I'll have you directing traffic in the Shetlands." Blair stomped off toward the main house to call his superiors and claim the glory. Hamish stood alone in the courtyard, the perfect image of a dismissed subordinate. But he knew the woman in the silver car was listening. She would have heard that a local had been blamed, and more importantly, she would have heard that the stupid local policeman was now alone at the crime scene. To her, this was the perfect moment to retrieve whatever Sterling had been hiding leverage or the loot that had brought her to this frozen wilderness in the first place. Hamish began to amble toward the west wing, his movements slow and aimless. He stopped by a small, inconspicuous stone shed that served as the estate's secondary pump house. He knew the castle's layout better than anyone. The west wing's drainage ran directly through here. If Sterling had been hiding something valuable and portable, he wouldn't have kept it in a safe. He would have hidden it somewhere a corporate executive would never look among the grime and the grease of the estate's inner workings. "Oh dear!" Hamish muttered loudly to Lugs, ensuring his voice carried toward the larches. "I hope poor Rory didn't drop Mr. Sterling's expensive briefcase in the old pump cistern. That would be a terrible shame for the evidence, wouldn't it?" He made a great show of fumbling with the heavy iron padlock on the shed door, pretending he couldn't get it open. He rattled the chain, cursed under his breath in Gaelic, and then sighed, leaning against the stone wall. "Well, lugs," my stomach is growling. "I think he'll just nip down to the kitchen for a quick sandwich. Nobody will mind if we leave the shed for 5 minutes, will they?" He turned and walked toward the main kitchen entrance, disappearing behind a thick stone buttress. But he didn't go inside. Instead, he doubled back through the shadows, slipping into a narrow crawlspace that overlooked the pump house. He settled into the darkness, his hand resting on Lug's collar to keep the dog silent. He didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the soft, expensive purr of a silver engine died out near the carriage house. Moments later, a ginger cat appeared, her silk scarf fluttering in the wind. She was moving quickly now, no longer a corporate ghost, but a desperate woman with a heavy tool in her hand to break the lock Hamish had so helpfully pointed out. The trap was set, the bait was taken, and the Highlands were about to reclaim one of their own. The woman moved with a frantic, sharp-edged precision that betrayed her city upbringing. She reached the door of the pump house, her breath hitching in the cold air as she swung a heavy iron tire against the padlock. The sound of metal striking metal echoed sharply against the castle's stone walls, a jarring intrusion into the Highland silence. After 3 desperate blows, the rusted hasp gave way with a screeching groan. She ducked inside the cramped, lightless shed, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom to find the water cistern Hamish had so helpfully mentioned. From his vantage point in the shadows of the buttress, Hamish watched her silhouette stoop over the murky water. She reached in, her arms submerged to the elbow, and let out a soft, triumphant gasp as she hauled out a small, waterproof metal box. "I believe that belongs to the estate, and not to a lady in such fine silk," Hamish said, stepping out from the darkness. He spoke softly, but the sound was like a gunshot in the confined space. The woman shrieked, spinning around and nearly dropping the box back into the cistern. Her flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating Hamish's face. Gone was the slack-jawed, vacant expression of the village constable. In its place was a hard, steady gaze, and a mouth set in a grim line. Beside him, Luggs let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the very floorboards of the shed. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "The stupid road cop! You're supposed to be in the kitchen eating a sandwich." "I have a very adaptable appetite," Hamish replied, his Highland lilt now sharp and precise. "And you, I take it, are the business partner Richard Sterling was so eager to avoid. Mrs. Sterling, perhaps. Or just the associate he tried to leave behind with the empty accounts and the looming fraud charges." The woman's eyes darted toward the door, but Hamish's lanky frame blocked the only exit. "He was a thief," she spat, clutching the metal box to her chest. "He was going to take everything the offshore codes, the bonds, everything and disappear into this godforsaken mist. I helped him build that empire, and he thought he could discard me like a used ledger. So you followed him," Hamish reasoned, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "You met him in the fog, you argued by the fountain, and after poor Rory Campbell gave him a shove and walked away, you decided to make the accident permanent. You hit him with those expensive heels of yours. I saw the mark on his leg. You and held his head under until the bubbling stopped. A messy business for such a clean car." The woman's face contorted into a mask of desperation. She didn't plead, she didn't cry. Instead, she lunged. She swung the tire iron with a vicious, surprising strength aimed straight for Hamish's temple. Hamish, showing the deceptive speed of a man who spent his life climbing crags and dodging angry bulls, pivoted on his heel. He caught her wrist in a grip of iron, the tire iron clattering to the stone floor. She fought with the ferocity of a cornered wildcat, scratching at his face and kicking at his shins, but Hamish simply held her at arm's length, his strength far superior to her frantic energy. Now, whist," he muttered, his voice calm despite the struggle. "There's no need for more violence. The Highlands have a way of catching up to people, mistress. You'd have been better off in London." Luggs barked sharply, a signal that the commotion had finally drawn attention. In the distance, the sound of slamming car doors and Blair's unmistakable, booming shout announced the return of the Strathbane detectives. The woman went limp in Hamish's arms, the fight draining out of her as she realized the game was truly over. She looked at the muddy, freezing floor of the pump house, and then at the lanky man in the ill-fitting uniform. "How?" she whispered, her voice broken. "How did a man like you know?" Hamish looked down at her, his hazel eyes briefly sympathetic before turning cold. "People in Lochdub talk a lot," he said simply. "But it's the ones who come here thinking we're too slow to listen who always find themselves in the most trouble. You were the only thing in the village that didn't fit the scenery." He led her out into the courtyard just as Blair's car screeched to a halt. The DCI burst out, looking livid that he hadn't found Rory Campbell at his cottage. He stopped dead when he saw Hamish holding a dishevelled high society woman and a metal box that screamed of high finance. Hamish immediately let his shoulders slump and his mouth hang open, the mask of the simpleton sliding back into place as if it had never left. "Oh, Mr. Blair," Hamish shouted, his voice returning to a slow, confused drawl. "I found this lady trying to break into the pump house. I think she might be lost, sir. She's got a very heavy box that looks terribly important." Blair stood frozen for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish as he stared at the scene before him. He looked from the pale, trembling woman in the fox fur stole to the muddy metal box in Hamish's hand, and finally to Hamish himself, who was currently wearing an expression of such profound, gormless confusion that it would have made a sheep look intellectual. The DCI's face began its familiar ascent through the colour spectrum, settling on a vibrant, pulsing magenta. He had just spent an hour screaming at a locked cottage door in the village, only to find that the local peasant had managed to stumble onto a second suspect and a pile of evidence while ostensibly looking for a sandwich. "Macbeth!" Blair finally bellowed, charging across the gravel. "What in the name of all that is holy is going on here? Who is this woman, and why are you manhandling a member of the public?" Hamish let out a long, slow whistle, scratching his red hair with his free hand while keeping a firm, yet seemingly accidental, grip on the woman's arm. "I'm sure I couldn't say, sir. I was just minding the pump house like you told Mule. You told me to guard the scene, and this is part of the scene, isn't it? And then this lady comes along with a tire iron and starts bashing the locks." "I thought she was a burglar, sir." I was fairly terrified, so I just grabbed her and hoped for the best. The woman, realizing her only hope lay in the arrogance of the man in the trench coat, let out a sharp, practiced sob. "Officer, thank God you're here. This savage attacked me. I was simply looking for my husband's belongings. Richard Sterling was my fiancé, and this man trapped me in that dark shed." Blair's eyes lit up. A grieving fiancé was a far more prestigious lead than a local plasterer with a grudge. He shoved Hamish aside, nearly knocking him over, and adopted what he clearly believed was a sympathetic manner. There, madame. DCI Blair, Strathbane CID. You're safe now. Macbeth, you towering oaf, give me that box this instant." Hamish handed it with a look of immense relief. "Oh, thank you, sir. It's a heavy thing, and I was worried it might be full of something dangerous. Like dynamite, maybe? Or tax records?" He leaned in close to Blair, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that ensured the woman could hear every word. She was trying to hide it in the water. "Mr. Blair. And her shoes, sir, they have a very funny shape to them. Like that mark on the dead man's leg. But I am sure a clever man like you already noticed that." Blair stiffened. He hadn't noticed the mark on the leg, been too busy shouting at the cloud sput. He wasn't about to admit that. He looked down at the woman's feet, then at the metal box, and then at the tire iron lying on the ground. The pieces of the puzzle were being handed to him on a silver platter, and all he had to do was pretend Head found them himself. He looked at Hamish, his narrow eyes filled with a sudden, calculating greed. If he arrested this woman for a high-profile corporate murder, Head be the hero of the Northern Constabulary. But if Macbeth got any of the credit, the promotion board might start asking why a constable in a backwater village was doing the CID's job. "Right," Blair snapped, puffing out his chest. "It's obvious what happened here. This woman followed Sterling to secure the stolen assets in that box. I've had my eye on the London connection since the moment I arrived. You just happened to be standing in the way when my trap finally snapped shut, Macbeth." He turned to Anderson and Higgins, who had just pulled up behind him. "Cuff her and get that box to the lab. I want it opened under my personal supervision. This is a massive breakthrough in a multi-million-pound fraud investigation." Hamish watched as they led the woman away. She shot him one final look of pure, concentrated venom, realizing too late that the stupid policeman had played her and Blair against each other with the skill of a master puppeteer. As the police cars began to peel away, Blair paused, pointing a thick finger at Hamish's chest. "As for you, Macbeth, keep your mouth shut about this. I'll mention in my report that you provided minor perimeter assistance, but don't you go thinking this makes you a detective. You're lucky I don't charge you with obstructing a DCI's investigation. Now, get back to your station and stay there." Hamish watched the taillights disappear into the gathering dusk. He stood in the quiet courtyard, the Highland air turning bitter and cold once more. He had lost his lobster, his morning had been a disaster, and he had just handed the biggest case of the year to a man who despised him. He couldn't have been happier. He was still the village constable of Lochstub. His life was his own, and most importantly, nobody was going to try and promote him to a desk in Strathbane for at least another 6 months. He whistled for lugs and began the long walk home.